Chapter 8. Chaos as a Way of Life. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. Rudyard Kipling. If. It took me about a month after my arrival at the Trump White House to have any chance to assess systematically how things worked inside. Dysfunctionality arose in many ways, often unfolding through specific policy issues, some of which I have described throughout this work. There were many more. During the last months of 2018 and early 2019, as Trump's second year in office came to an end, roughly 8 to 9 months after my arrival, several seemingly disparate issues and individuals converged to push the administration even deeper into uncharted territory. In early June 2018, for example, Kelly tried a new tactic on Trump's schedule, beginning each day in the Oval at 11 a.m. with Chief of Staff time, hoping to minimize the rambling lectures he delivered during his twice-weekly intelligence briefings. Of course, what most people found striking was that Trump's official day didn't start until almost lunchtime. Trump was not loafing during the morning. Instead, he spent considerable time working the phones in the residence. He talked to all manner of people, sometimes U.S. government officials. I spoke with him by phone before he arrived in the Oval nearly every day due to the press of events he needed to know about or I needed direction on. But he also spoke at length to people outside the government. It was an anomaly among contemporary presidents by any definition. By contrast, a regular day for President George H.W. Bush, described by his first Chief of Staff, former Governor John Sununu, started like this. The President began his formal day in the Oval Office with an 8 a.m. intelligence briefing that would include the President, the Vice President, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, and me. That meeting, the President's Daily Briefing, PDB, was presented by the CIA and would take 10 to 15 minutes. Following that, always on the calendar for 8:15, was a separate half-hour for Scowcroft to bring the President and us up to date on all foreign policy issues arising from the events that occurred overnight or were expected during the course of the upcoming day. That briefing segued into a similar one at 8:45 that I would lead, addressing all other issues beyond foreign policy. Scowcroft usually stayed for that as well. My meeting was scheduled to end at 9:15. I would have thought I had died and gone to heaven to have had such an orderly approach to preparing for an upcoming day. As it was, Trump generally had only 2 intelligence briefings per week, and in most of those, he spoke at greater length than the briefers, often on matters completely unrelated to the subjects at hand. Trump's schedule was the easiest anomaly to deal with. One of the hardest was his vindictiveness, as demonstrated by the constant eruptions against John McCain, even after McCain died and could do Trump no more harm. Another example of his vindictiveness was Trump's August 15th decision to revoke former CIA Director John Brennan's security clearance. Now, Brennan was no prize, and during his tenure, the CIA became more politicized than at any other time in its history. He denied any improper behavior, but Trump was convinced Brennan was deeply implicated in abusing the FISA surveillance process to spy on his 2016 campaign, all of which was exacerbated by his constant presence in the media criticizing Trump after he took office. The press fastened on the revocation immediately after Sanders announced it during her daily noon briefing. Kelly said to me, "This Brennan thing is exploding," having spent much of the afternoon on it. "This is big." In an hour-long conversation just between the two of us, we went over what had happened. Kelly said that by mid to late July, he thought he had gotten Trump off the idea of taking away people's clearances, but Trump returned to it because his favorite media sources kept pounding away on it. Earlier in the day, Trump had wanted to revoke clearances from a longer list of names, but had settled for Sanders reading the names out at the briefing, implicitly threatening to revoke the clearances at some point in the future. I pointed out that the whole idea had started with Rand Paul. It was largely symbolic, because having a security clearance didn't mean Brennan or anyone else could just walk into the CIA and read whatever interested him. He had to have a need to know, and for anything really important, he would have to be read into the appropriate compartments. Kelly said he had had an argument with Trump about it, not the first such confrontation, but one that had obviously been harsher than previous ones. Kelly told Trump it was not presidential, which was true, and he told me it was Nixonian, also true. Has there ever been a presidency like this? Kelly asked me, and I assured him there had not. I thought there was a case against Brennan for politicizing the CIA, but Trump had obscured it by the blatantly political approach he took. It would only get worse if more clearances were lifted. Kelly agreed. In what by this point was already an emotional discussion for both of us, Kelly showed me a picture of his son killed in Afghanistan in 2010. Trump had referred to him earlier that day, saying to Kelly, "You suffered the worst." Since Trump was disparaging the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq at the time, he had seemingly implied that Kelly's son had died needlessly. "Trump doesn't care what happens to these guys," Kelly said. "He says it would be cool to invade Venezuela." I said relatively little during the conversation, which was mostly Kelly venting his frustrations, very few of which I disagreed with. I couldn't see how it was possible he would stay through the 2020 elections, though Trump had announced a few weeks before that he would. When I left Kelly's office, I said nothing to anyone else. Perhaps uniquely in presidential history, Trump engendered controversy over attendance at funerals, starting with Barbara Bush's in April 2018, which Trump did not attend, although 4 former presidents and the First Lady did, and then at John McCain's in late August. Kelly opened the weekly White House staff meeting on August 27th by saying, "I'm in a bad place today," because of ongoing disagreements with Trump over whether to fly U.S. government flags at half-mast and who would attend which services. McCain's family didn't want Trump at the services either, so the feeling was mutual. The final decision was that Pence would lead the administration's representation at both the Capitol Rotunda ceremony and the funeral service at Washington National Cathedral. The service was extremely well attended, with all the socializing that routinely accompanies even moments of passing. Among others I greeted were Bush 43 and Mrs. Bush, with Bush asking cheerily, "Still got a job, Bolton?" "For now," I answered, and we all laughed. When George H.W. Bush later died during the Buenos Aires G20, Trump declared a national day of mourning, issued a fitting presidential statement, and spoke cordially with both George W. and Jeb Bush during the morning. He and the First Lady attended the National Cathedral service on December 5th without incident. It wasn't so hard to do after all. During the controversy over McCain's funeral, Trump tweeted that White House counsel Don McGahn was leaving at the end of the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation battle. Although McGahn had often joked to me, "We're all only one tweet away," this was a classic example of Trump's announcing something already decided without giving McGahn a chance to announce it first. I should have paid closer heed. As Kelly confirmed to me later, tensions between Trump and McGahn had become unsustainable because of McGahn's truthful testimony to and cooperation with Mueller's investigation. Even though Trump's outside attorneys had approved McGahn's role, they were all reportedly surprised by just how candid he was. In any event, the search for a replacement was immediately on. Illegal immigration, a key Trump initiative, was a shambles. White House lawyer John Eisenberg approached me in mid-May 2018 to see if I had any interest in trying to repair the collapsed White House policy process on immigration generally and at the Mexican border in particular. I had no interest entering that arena without the White House counsel's office and justice fully on board. Don McGahn, who for the best of reasons focused every waking moment on judicial nominations, saw immigration policy for the swamp it was and decided to stay out of it. Justice had its own problems. Now alerted, however, I kept my eye on the issue but followed McGahn's example. I saw the problem firsthand at a cabinet meeting on immigration held on May 9th, the day after we escaped the Iran nuclear deal. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen and Jeff Sessions were to report on what their respective departments were doing to close the Mexican border, followed by other cabinet members discussing their areas. But this was not to be a briefing where Trump listened appreciatively to his team's efforts, asked a few questions, and then patted them on their backs. Things went downhill after Sessions concluded just as Nielsen was starting. Trump asked her why we couldn't close the border, and Nielsen answered by listing all the difficulties she and her department faced. Trump interrupted, saying in front of the entire cabinet and a coterie of White House aides, his voice rising, "You're wrong. There's no way we can't close the border. Tell them the country is closed. We don't have the people, such as immigration judges, to do all these things. That's it. It's like a movie theater when it gets filled." This was already bad, but it got worse. Kelly tried to support Nielsen, who was effectively his protege, but that was a mistake. Everyone knew Nielsen had the Homeland Security job largely because of Kelly, and his intervention made it look like she couldn't defend herself, which was unfortunately proving to be true before a packed cabinet room. Kelly and Nielsen tried to turn things back towards Sessions, who appeared to say something new and different about the Department of Homeland Security's authority at the border. He was uncomfortable discussing the issue and seemingly reversed himself, basically saying the department did not have the authority he had just explained it did. Kelly fired back, "We're going to do what the Attorney General says is illegal and send them, the immigrants, back." And Sessions twisted a little more. But Trump was still after Nielsen, and she didn't have the wit to either remain silent or say, "We'll get back to you in a few days with a better answer." Finally, as if anyone could have missed the point, Trump said, "I got elected on this issue, and now I'm going to get unelected," which might not have been far from the political truth. I thought as the meeting drew to a close, it was only a matter of time before both Nielsen and Kelly resigned. And according to numerous press reports, Nielsen came very close in Kelly's office right afterward. This issue was a total mess and unnecessary, because there was much that could be done to tighten up on fraudulent, unjustifiable, and made-up claims for asylum in the United States. Things worsened further on June 20th. In a zero-tolerance policy, Trump had been prepared to separate children from their parents, or people claiming to be their parents, but who were frequently human traffickers at the border, as prior administrations, including Obama's, had done. But under political pressure, Trump reversed himself, in effect, hanging Nielsen and Sessions out to dry. After the executive order revoking zero tolerance was signed, Kelly just went home. He confirmed to me the next day his view that Trump had sold out Sessions and Nielsen, but no one had a real plan what to do next. Immigration was also jumbled in with the negotiation and ratification efforts to modify the NAFTA agreement with Canada and Mexico, foreign aid programs in Central America, and enormous turf fights among the Departments of Justice, Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, State, and others over who had what responsibility. These problems were due largely to the chaos in domestic policymaking, a problem that showed no signs of abating. Despite my efforts to stay out of the immigration stew, it kept chasing me. On October 4th, Kushner, now involved in immigration because of the spillover from the NAFTA revision effort, came to see me. He said Nielsen and her department were negotiating with Mexico's government with no State Department clearance, an obvious process foul if true. A few days later, on a Saturday, Kushner called to say Trump had suggested that he take over the immigration portfolio. He had declined because he felt Kelly was protecting Nielsen from the consequences of her own incompetence, which made the problem unfixable. "What about Bolton?" Trump asked. "Could he take it over?" Kushner said he doubted I would be interested, but Trump replied, "John's great. He gets things done. He brings me all these decisions and stuff. Really great. Can you ask him if he'd do it?" Kushner said whomever Trump selected would be in a fight with Kelly, and Trump replied, "John's not afraid of fights. He'll take him, Kelly, on." Wonderful, I thought. Great Saturday. On Monday morning, Columbus Day, I met with Stephen Miller, the White House policy lead on immigration. As we were talking, Kushner walked in and asked, "Can I join the conspiracy?" I had already emailed Pompeo, who had agreed Mexico-related immigration issues had to be brought more effectively into the NSC process, which had been frustrated for months, if not years, primarily by the Department of Homeland Security's lack of cooperation. The department just didn't want to be coordinated. My personal view was that America would benefit from far more legal, controlled immigration, whereas illegal immigration was undermining the foundational sovereignty principle that the U.S. decided who was allowed in, not the would-be immigrants. I was clear on one thing. Nielsen's effort to bring in the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to help us decide who to admit to the U.S. was badly flawed. We could hardly cede such basic sovereign decisions to an international body. Later in the week, after an unrelated meeting in the Oval, attended by Nielsen, Pompeo, and others, Trump was pounding away again. "We're doing the worst job on the border of any administration. I ran and won on the border. We have a national emergency," he said, and he then riffed on finding money in the Pentagon budget to build the border wall he had long promised. Trump's agitation was based in part on sensational media reporting about caravans of illegal immigrants heading through Central America toward our border, which he saw as visible proof he was not meeting his 2016 campaign pledge. Pointing to Nielsen, Trump said, "You're in charge of border security." And then, pointing to Pompeo, he said, "You're not involved." This was directly contrary to what Trump had told Kushner on Saturday, and convinced me I was happy to be as little involved in this exercise as possible. On and on it went between Trump and Nielsen. At one point, Pompeo whispered to me, "Why are we still here?" Good question. We needed to find a way out of this train wreck before Trump blamed us for the collapse of his border policy. According to Kushner, however, this latest encounter with Nielsen convinced Trump I should have control of the issue. "Kirsten is not mentally able to do it," said Kushner. 2 days later, Trump told me, "You take over the southern border. She loses every case. She's so weak." Trump wanted to declare a national emergency and had already talked to John Eisenberg about it. "You have my full authorization," said Trump. "The number one thing is the southern border. You and me. You are the fucking boss." A few hours later, with just Kelly and me in the Oval, Trump said, "I told John to take control of the border." This was getting serious. I decided to lay out for Trump the process required to get control of illegal immigration issues. If he agreed to it, I would step in, but if not, I had plenty of other work to do. I drafted a one-page plan that included giving lead international negotiation authority to the State Department, rewriting all the relevant Homeland Security and Justice regulations, proposing sweeping new legislation on the issue, vesting policy development authority in the NSC, replacing Nielsen and Sessions, and more. I was writing for a one-person audience, but I showed drafts to Pompeo, Miller, Kushner, Eisenberg, and a few others who generally concurred. In the meantime, the caravan issue was growing steadily more neuralgic. Trump, tweeting prodigiously, asked that executive orders closing the borders be drafted, and the White House atmosphere grew increasingly febrile. On the morning of October 18th, Pompeo and I were in my office talking about the Khashoggi affair when Kelly asked both of us to come to his office. There, a mass meeting, perhaps 15 people, was in progress on the Mexico border, which Kelly summarized when Pompeo and I entered. He then asked Nielsen to describe her plan, which had the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees staffing processing facilities on the Guatemala-Mexico border. The High Commissioner's office would separate out legitimate refugees who could then enter the United States or another country from those not qualifying who would return to their countries of origin. Kelly asked Pompeo what he thought, and he responded slowly, likely knowing little about what Nielsen was saying. I jumped in, and Pompeo happily receded, to point out that the High Commissioner had no real role in this kind of immigration processing work, that its budget and personnel were already overstrained by, among other things, the Venezuelan refugee crisis, and that in any case, the U.S. shouldn't subcontract decisions on admission to the U.S. to the United Nations. Nielsen couldn't answer these points, so I continued to probe on what the refugee agency's role would be as she stumbled through her responses. Kelly asked, "Well then, what's your plan, John?" Of course, my plan was something I had no intention of discussing in a stadium-sized crowd before I had even shown it to Trump. I simply said, "Yes, I have a plan, which he, Trump, asked for, and which I will discuss with him." That caused Nielsen to do a flounce and turn her back on me, saying, "Huh," or something like that. I said, "That's exactly why I want to see the president alone." The conversation meandered around for a few minutes more, nearing 10 a.m., when I said to Kelly, "John, we should get down to the Oval to talk Saudi Arabia, just to remind everyone else that the rest of the world was still out there." Off, Pompeo, Kelly, and I went. Suffice it to say, this was not the profanity-laced shouting match the credulous media later reported. In the Oval, we were addressing the Khashoggi issue with Trump when Madeleine Westerhout came in, saying Kushner wanted to report by phone on his conversation with Mexico's foreign minister. Kelly asked loudly, "Why is Jared calling the Mexicans?" "Because I asked him to," said Trump in an equally loud voice. "How else are we going to stop the caravans?" "Kirstjen Nielsen is working on this," said Kelly, still loudly, and Trump shot back, "None of your other geniuses have been able to stop the caravans," at which point Kelly stomped out of the Oval, Trump waving his hands dismissively at Kelly's back as he left. This conversation could qualify as shouting, but there was no profanity here either. Kushner, now on the speakerphone, described his call with Luis Videgaray, while Pompeo steamed quietly, since Kushner was once again doing his job. There was some further desultory conversation, and then Pompeo and I headed back to Kelly's office. In a December conversation with Trump, as he decided on Kelly's successor, Trump acknowledged that this exchange with Kelly was the shouting match about which the press had spilled so many electrons. Several people were milling around in Kelly's outer office. He called Pompeo and me in, said, "I'm out of here," and walked out. Somewhat dazed, I suppose. Pompeo and I spoke further on Saudi Arabia, but it then hit us that Kelly meant something more than just, "You can use my office," when he walked out. I opened the door to ask where Kelly was, but no one knew. I went into the hallway, saw him speaking to someone, pulled him into the Roosevelt room, which was empty, and shut the door. This was our second emotional conversation, even more intense than the first. "I've commanded men in combat," he said, "and I've never had to put up with shit like that," referring to what had just happened in the Oval. I could see his resignation coming, so I asked, "But what is the alternative if you resign?" Kelly said, "What if we have a real crisis like 9/11 with the way he makes decisions?" I asked, "Do you think it will be better if you leave? At least wait until after the election. If you resign now, the whole election could go bad." "Maybe it would be better that way," he answered bitterly. So I said, "Whatever you do will be honorable. But there's nothing positive about the likes of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders having more authority." He answered, "I'm going out to Arlington, presumably to visit his son's grave, which he did at serious times. We knew this because it happened so often." I left the Roosevelt Room for Kelly's office, where Pompeo was still waiting before going out to speak to the press about Khashoggi. After his press gaggle, we spoke in my office about what to do, Kelly having left. It was grim. "Mattis is always overseas," Pompeo said. "The VP is in Mississippi talking about religious freedom, and the only thing Mnuchin thinks about is covering his ass. This will just leave you and me, worrying that Kelly could go at any time. If he, Trump, wants to know who the real warriors are, just look around," meaning us. "And Kelly is part of that." I agreed. Realizing how bad it all sounded, Pompeo said, "This whole thing could end up being the Donald, Ivanka, and Jared show." In the midst of all this, in the early afternoon, I showed Trump my one-page immigration plan. He read through it and said he agreed with it, but added, "You know, most of this I can't do until after the election," which I said I understood. He asked if he could keep the one-pager, folded it, and put it in his suit coat pocket. The ball was in his court, and from my perspective, that's where it stayed. The immigration issue rolled on, but largely without me. I had made my suggestions, which may or may not have worked had they been fully carried out, and ultimately Trump did pick bits and pieces of them. But he did it in his own way in his own time, which was his prerogative. Immigration issues stumbled along rather than forming a coherent policy. During the immigration controversy came the bombshell of the disappearance and then the assassination of Saudi Arabian journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Trump's handling of Khashoggi's murder was in stark contrast to his usual decision-making. On October 8th, Kushner asked how we should respond to the growing storm. My advice to the Saudis was to get the facts out immediately, whatever they were, and get it over with. Kushner agreed, and the next day we spoke with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, emphasizing how seriously this issue was already viewed. I urged the Crown Prince to find out exactly what had happened to Khashoggi and then publish the report before people's imaginations exploded. Pompeo later made the same point to him. I also proposed we send the Saudi ambassador in Washington back to Riyadh to get the facts and then come back and brief us. This was unorthodox, but the ambassador was the Crown Prince's younger brother and could reinforce firsthand what the temperature was in Washington. Unlike with so many other issues, however, Trump had essentially already decided on his response, saying in a pre-taped interview for 60 Minutes for the coming weekend that he wasn't going to cut off arms sales to the kingdom. On Saturday, when we welcomed Pastor Brunson to the White House after his release from Turkey, I suggested Pompeo go to Saudi Arabia rather than sending a lower-ranking official, which he and Trump liked. No one could say we weren't taking this seriously. Trump raised the idea with King Salman on October 15th, and the king said he would welcome Pompeo's visit. Trump was feeling pressure from the U.S. media, but the pressure was unexpectedly moving him towards stronger public support for the kingdom, not less. Pompeo's whirlwind trip bought some time, during which the Saudis would have more opportunity to get the facts out, but Trump was not waiting. The Saudis subsequently published their version of the events and fired several senior officials. The Saudi report didn't satisfy most analysts, but it reflected a narrative that obviously wasn't going to change. During this period, through tweets and statements, Trump supported the emerging Saudi version and never wavered from both the U.S.-Saudi alliance generally or the massive arms sales already negotiated with the kingdom. With the media in a foaming-at-the-mouth frenzy, Trump decided to issue an unequivocal statement of support for Mohammed bin Salman, which he essentially dictated to Pompeo. The text was utterly unqualified and thus risked harming Trump himself if the facts changed. It was not all that difficult to make a few editorial changes to build in protection, but Pompeo would not accept any changes or even hold the draft a day for further review. Pompeo said, "He asked for it and I'm sending it in." A characteristic, "Yes, sir, roger that" answer. The next day, November 20th, my birthday, Trump wanted to call bin Salman to tell him the statement was coming out, saying, "We're doing him a hell of a favor," namely stating that, whether he did it or not, we're standing with Saudi Arabia. We debated whether Trump himself would read the statement from the White House podium or whether we would just release the text. "This will divert from Ivanka," Trump said. "If I read the statement in person, this will take over the Ivanka thing." The Ivanka thing was a flood of stories about Ivanka's extensive use of her personal email for government business, which the White House was trying to explain was actually quite different from Hillary Clinton's extensive use of her personal email for government business. "God damn it, why didn't she change her phone?" Trump complained. "What a mess we have because of that phone." Then he turned to Pompeo, settling on his calling the Crown Prince, and said, "Tell him it's unbelievable, what a great thing I'm doing. Then get his opinion, and we'll decide what to do." We decided to issue a statement and have Pompeo answer questions, but there was considerable debate over whether the text should be released before or after the annual ceremony pardoning the Thanksgiving turkey. Pun not intended. Sorry, Crown Prince, but we have our priorities. I met with Turkey's foreign minister that same day. Another coincidence. Pompeo and Trump both ultimately took questions, which Trump had wanted to do anyway. It was an all-Trump show, obvious to everyone except Rand Paul, who tweeted that he thought I had written the statement. In hard-nosed geopolitical terms, Trump's was the only sensible approach. No one excused Khashoggi's murder, and few doubted it was a serious mistake. Whether or not you liked Saudi Arabia, the monarchy, Mohammed bin Salman, or Khashoggi, we had significant U.S. national interests at stake. Withdrawing support would immediately trigger countervailing efforts by our adversaries in the region to exploit the situation to our detriment. Putin had earlier put it to me most bluntly in Moscow, see Chapter 6, on October 23rd, saying Russia could sell arms to the Saudis if we didn't. Trump wasn't necessarily deciding on the basis of geostrategic reality, but on the U.S. jobs generated by the arms sales, and he ended up in more or less the right place. This approach was exactly Jeane Kirkpatrick's conclusion in her iconic 1979 essay, Dictatorships and Double Standards. Liberal idealism need not be identical with masochism, and need not be incompatible with the defense of freedom and the national interest. Personnel management issues, also critical to policy development, portended a series of dramatic changes following the November 2018 congressional elections. Jim Mattis and his staff, for example, had a masterful command of press relations, carefully cultivating his reputation as a warrior scholar. One story I was sure the media hadn't heard from Mattis was one told by Trump on May 25th as Marine One flew back to the White House from Annapolis after Trump's graduation speech to the Naval Academy. He said Mattis had told him, regarding Trump's appearing in a scheduled presidential debate with Clinton just days after the Access Hollywood story broke in the press, that it was the bravest thing he had ever seen anyone do. Coming from a career military man, that was indeed something. Of course, Trump could have been making it up, but if not, it showed Mattis knew how to flatter with the best of them. There was no doubt Mattis was in troubled waters by the summer of 2018, and he grew steadily weaker as the year unfolded. At about 9:45 p.m. on Sunday, September 16th, Trump called me to ask if I had seen a prominently displayed New York Times article about Mattis and read it carefully, which I said I had. "I don't like it," said Trump. "Mattis is always doing this kind of thing." I said I thought the article was very unfair to Deputy National Security Advisor Mira Ricardel, brought on by the enmity she had earned from Mattis in her early days at the White House, where she resisted Mattis's efforts to hire Democrats with views incompatible with Trump's. "She stopped Rex from bringing in some of his people too, right?" Trump asked, which was also true. "What do you think of Mattis?" Trump asked, in line with his management style, which almost no one believed was conducive to building trust and confidence among his subordinates. But he did it all the time, and only a fool would not assume that if he asked me questions about Mattis, he was surely asking others about me. I gave a partial answer which was both true and important. I said Mattis was good at not doing what he didn't want to do, and that he had a high opinion of his own opinion. With that, Trump was off, explaining that he didn't trust Mattis, and how tired he was of constant press stories about Mattis's outwitting Trump. I didn't say it to Trump, but this was the biggest self-inflicted wound by the axis of adults. They thought themselves so smart they could tell the world how smart they were, and Trump wouldn't figure it out. They were not as smart as they thought. Kelly came to my office late the next morning to talk about the article, saying Mattis is just in survival mode now, and that he was pointing the finger for the leaks at Ricardel, which showed amazing chutzpah. I explained Judge Larry Silberman's theory about assessing leaks, namely asking cui bono, which means who stands to gain, and which, in this case, pointed squarely to Mattis and his associates being the leakers. Kelly had served under Mattis in the Marines, as had Joe Dunford, a remarkable alignment the press never seemed to notice, and that a spy novelist could not have convinced a publisher was plausible. Trump, Kelly, and I discussed the article again later in the day, and Trump asked, "Mattis didn't like canceling the Iran deal, did he?" Which was an understatement. Shortly thereafter, the speculation on Mattis's replacement picked up again in earnest. I wondered if the leaks started in the Oval Office. 1 week later, however, when I was in New York for the annual opening festivities of the UN General Assembly, Kelly called me to say the First Lady wanted Ricardel fired because her staff complained she had been uncooperative in preparing for FLOTUS's upcoming trip to Africa. I found this stunning, and Kelly said it was not clear how it got to this level. He then characterized the First Lady's staff as a bunch of catty, gossipy sorority types. No one said anything further to me, and I thought it had died away. Kelly was still in Washington because of this Rosenstein thing, meaning the stories about whether Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein had ever proposed invoking the 25th Amendment against Trump, or that he wear a wire into the Oval to gather evidence to that end. This was also a first in presidential management history. Being in New York reminded me why UN ambassadors should not have cabinet rank, the traditional Republican approach, or, if they were going to have that rank, they needed to be told by the president that there was nonetheless only one Secretary of State. Haley had never gotten that reminder, and from everything I heard, including directly from Trump, she and Tillerson cordially detested one another. Well, maybe not cordially. Early evidence of the Haley problem occurred in her mishandling of the Russia sanctions question in the immediate aftermath of the April U.S. attack on Syria. It emerged again in June regarding U.S. withdrawal from the UN's misbegotten Human Rights Council. Trump agreed to leave it, which all of his advisers recommended, confirming it in an Oval Office meeting with Pompeo, Haley, and me. Trump then asked Haley, "How's it going?" And she responded by talking about the trade negotiations with China, which formed no part of her responsibilities. After a lengthy trade riff by Trump with all his favorite lines, "The EU is just like China, only smaller," Haley asked him about a trip she wanted to take to India to visit the Dalai Lama. The purpose of this trip was unclear other than getting a photo op with the Dalai Lama, always good for an aspiring Paul. But the minefield she strayed into by raising the China trade issue showed a political tin ear. Once Trump wondered how China would view Haley's seeing the Dalai Lama, the trip was essentially dead. This episode confirmed to Pompeo how far out of line Trump had allowed Haley to drift and why it had to stop. In any case, on June 19th, we withdrew from the Human Rights Council. Replacing departing senior administration officials could also be arduous, especially as the halfway mark in Trump's term neared. Choosing Haley's successor was one such marathon. After conferring alone with Trump, Ivanka, and Kushner on a purely personal matter, Haley told Kelly, but not Pompeo or me, on October 9th that she was resigning, although that resignation came with a long recessional extending until its effective date on December 31st. Few doubted the 2024 race for the Republican presidential nomination had now begun. In a jaw-dropping statement sitting next to the president in the Oval, Haley ruled out a 2020 run, just so she could remind everyone she was available. "No, I'm not running for 2020. I can promise you what I'll be doing is campaigning for this one." Many thought she was instead running to replace Pence as Trump's 2020 running mate, supported by Kushner and Ivanka, which was not idle speculation. One Trump prerequisite for Haley's successor was that it be a female. Early favorite Dina Powell had been at the NSC and, preferred by the family, initially appeared to be a shoo-in. Enormous opposition developed, however, and the search was quickly on for other candidates. Pompeo and I agreed from the outset that the UN ambassador should not have cabinet rank, but we first had to persuade Trump. He said of Powell that cabinet status will help her out, which left me speechless. If someone needed that kind of help, they should have been looking for other work. In addition to the status issue, Pompeo and I discussed over several weeks possible alternatives, conferring with several of them to see if they were interested. When the sorting was done, we both concluded that Ambassador to Canada Kelly Craft was the most logical choice. In addition to being qualified, Craft was already in the administration, had been fully vetted and granted appropriate security clearances, and was therefore ready quickly to assume new duties. In the meantime, the White House lapsed into full conspiracy mode, as everyone had an opinion about who should succeed Haley. I never went through a time where more people told me not to trust other people on an issue. Perhaps they were all right. The internal politics were Byzantine, much of it played out in the media. Candidates rose and fell, entered and withdrew, and then entered again, came close, or were actually picked, only to find some disqualifying factor took them out of the running and us back to the beginning. Even when Pompeo and I thought we had Trump decided on one candidate, we were often wrong. As Pompeo said at the November G20 meeting, "You can't leave him alone for a minute." It was like being in a hall of mirrors. As the weeks passed, I wondered if we would have a nominee in time to get her confirmed before Haley's 3-month-long curtain call ended on New Year's Eve. Indeed, we didn't. Not until February 22nd in the Oval Office, when Trump called me down in mid-afternoon, did Trump and Kelly Craft shake hands on the nomination. I was delighted, as was Pompeo, but dismayed that nearly 5 months had disappeared on something that could have been resolved in just days after Haley's announcement. Trump said to Craft, "It's the best job in government next to mine," which I thought wasn't far from wrong. We were done, at least with the executive branch deliberations. Almost 5 months in the making. As Mattis's troubles continued to rise, speculation turned to whether Kelly might also have finally had enough. Pompeo said, "If Mattis goes, Kelly goes too," which had a logic to it. This was now beyond personal dysfunction, but meant a major change in White House direction. Nielsen's unending problems with Trump also seemed to indicate her early departure, another incentive for Kelly to leave, but she hung on. Indeed, Nielsen lasted until April 2019, probably long after she should have left voluntarily for her own well-being. Kelly and Kushner also had not gotten along well since the controversy over Kushner's security clearance. Kelly also had his troubles, not unlike those I experienced, with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, a Trump confidant. In July 2018, for example, Mnuchin fussed endlessly about a press release he wanted to issue on new sanctions against a Russian bank that had facilitated North Korea's international financial transactions. Trump agreed the sanctions should proceed, but he didn't want a press release to avoid potential negative reactions from Moscow and Pyongyang. Mnuchin feared Congress would grill him for covering up for Russia if he didn't issue something. I thought he was overwrought, and a few days later, Trump agreed to a release. Exasperated, Kelly told me Mnuchin cared more than anything not to be exposed to any risk, notwithstanding his inordinate desire to attend Oval Office meetings and travel the world. A few days before, Kelly and I had spoken about Mnuchin's efforts to get into meetings where he had no role, including calling Trump to get himself invited. Kelly said he was sure Mnuchin spent far less than half his time at his desk at Treasury. So eager was he to go to White House meetings or on presidential trips. They hardly recognize him in his building, said Kelly disdainfully. In the meantime, Mattis's long-standing efforts to fire Ricardel, combined with the clandestine efforts of the First Lady's staff, finally had their effect. I was in Paris for meetings in advance of Trump's arrival to attend the November 11th World War I Armistice Day centenary. On the evening of November 9th, as I was walking to dinner with my British, French, and German counterparts, Kelly called me from Air Force One, which was nearing arrival in Paris. We were on non-secure phones, so we didn't talk fully until closer to midnight, when Kelly said the First Lady's office was still trying to get Ricardel fired. "I have nothing to do with this," said Kelly. On Saturday, I went to the U.S. ambassador's residence where Trump was staying to brief him before his bilateral with Macron. The weather was bad, and Kelly and I spoke about whether to travel as planned to the Chateau Thierry Belleau Wood monuments and nearby American cemeteries where many U.S. World War I dead were buried. Marine One's crew was saying that bad visibility could make it imprudent to chopper to the cemetery. The ceiling was not too low for Marines to fly in combat, but flying POTUS was obviously something very different. If a motorcade were necessary, it could take between 90 and 120 minutes each way, along roads that were not exactly freeways, posing an unacceptable risk that we could not get the president out of France quickly enough in case of an emergency. It was a straightforward decision to cancel the visit, but very hard for a Marine like Kelly to recommend, having originally been the one to suggest Belleau Wood, an iconic battle in Marine Corps history. Trump agreed, and it was decided that others would drive to the cemetery instead. As the meeting broke up and we prepared to leave for the Élysée Palace to see Macron, Trump pulled Kelly and me aside and said, "Find another spot for Mira. Melania's people are on the warpath." Kelly and I assumed we were to find an equivalent position elsewhere in government in a calmer setting in Washington. The press turned canceling the cemetery visit into a story that Trump was afraid of the rain, and took glee in pointing out that other world leaders traveled around during the day. Of course, none of them were the President of the United States, but the press didn't understand that rules for U.S. presidents are different from the rules for 190 other leaders who don't command the world's greatest military forces. Trump blamed Kelly unfairly, marking a possibly decisive moment in ending his White House tenure. Trump was displeased throughout the trip, he's in a royal funk, as Sanders put it, because of the disappointing election results, and nothing made things better. The rest of the Paris visit was similar. Macron opened their bilateral meeting by talking about a European army, as he had been doing publicly earlier, which a large number of other Americans were fully prepared to let the ungrateful Europeans have without us. Macron all but insulted Trump in his November 11th speech at the Arc de Triomphe, saying, "Patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism by saying, 'Our interest first. Who cares about the others?'" Trump said he didn't hear Macron's rebuff because his earpiece cut off at the critical point. After Paris, I flew on to the United Arab Emirates and then Singapore to help support the Vice President's trip to the annual Association of Southeast Asian Nations Summit. At 2:20 a.m. on November 14th, Ricardel called to say there was a Wall Street Journal story obviously leaked from an unfriendly source that she was about to be fired. The story was also full of speculation on Kelly and Nielsen's being fired, so I immediately called to reach Trump, Singapore being 13 hours ahead of Washington, and others to find out what was happening. In the interim, an incredible tweet went out from the office of the First Lady that Ricardel no longer deserved to work at the White House. Talk about unprecedented. I was still digesting this when Trump called me back at about 5:30 a.m. He asked, "What is this thing from the First Lady?" and called to Westerhout to bring him the tweet, which he read for the first time. "Holy fuck," he shouted. "How could they put that out without showing it to me?" Good question, I thought. "Let me work on this," Trump concluded. Trump later called Ricardel and the FLOTUS staffers into the Oval, where they presented their versions of the FLOTUS Africa trip Ricardel had tried to keep from going off the rails due to the ignorance and insensitivity of the First Lady's staffers. Ricardel had never actually met the First Lady. All the criticism was from her staff. Trump was justifiably irritated by the tweet from the office of the First Lady, which the staffers denied they were responsible for. "That statement is crap," said Trump correctly. I spoke to Pence about Ricardel when the two of us had a private lunch. "She's great," he said, and promised to be totally supportive. Kelly called later in the day to say Trump had instructed him, after the Oval meeting, "Find a place for her to land. We should keep her in the government," and that he'd said, "She's not a bad person," despite what the FLOTUS staffers had alleged. Kelly went on to say Paris was a complete disaster, and that Trump had complained incessantly on Air Force One flying back to Washington and even thereafter. He kept rehashing what had gone wrong, along with demanding that Mattis and Nielsen be fired, largely due to the Mexican border issue. Kelly said he had gotten Trump off a number of ledges, but was not at all sure what would come next. I asked him to keep me posted, and he said simply, "Okay, pal," which told me he didn't have a lot of friends left at the White House. Trump issued a statement the next day that Ricardel would be transitioning to a new job in the administration, although we didn't have it nailed down yet. Unfortunately, the atmosphere had been so poisoned by the FLOTUS staff that Ricardel decided on her own simply to leave government entirely and rejoin the private sector. The whole thing was appalling to me and grossly unfair to Ricardel. I did my own evaluation of the NSC after almost 9 months. Substantively, we had met a do-no-harm standard, entering no new bad deals and exiting several inherited from days gone by. For example, the Iran nuclear deal, the INF Treaty. But I could sense turmoil was coming on other fronts. As the November election approached, the rumor mills were going full speed, especially given the disappointing results, and after Armistice Day, rumors circulated constantly about who might succeed Kelly. One persistent theory was that Trump would select Nick Ayers, Pence's chief of staff. It was unusual, to say the least, to move from working for the VP to working for the president, but Jim Baker had gone from being George H.W. Bush's campaign manager in 1980 to being Reagan's White House chief of staff. Ayer's political skills made him a logical choice if Kelly decided to leave for a president looking toward a re-election campaign, but the real question was whether Ayers wanted it. He sought in advance to define the terms of the role, and Trump seemed amenable to doing so, but repeatedly reneged on key points or dismissed the entire idea of a job description as unworkable. Although Ayers was tempted by the job, the experiences of the past 2 years had convinced him that, without a piece of paper to fall back on in times of crisis, the risk was not worth taking. Of course, it was an open question whether the piece of paper would have ever been worth anything, but that question would never be answered. While this personnel pot simmered, the Mattis pot came to a boil. Nonetheless, I still fully expected Ayers would be named to succeed Kelly, likely on Monday, December 10, 2018. Kelly told me that morning at 6:30 a.m., one of our last early conversations, that after 2 days working directly for Trump as an experiment, Ayers had decided it would simply not work. Kelly was also convinced Trump planned to swap Haley for Pence as the 2020 VP nominee, which would have put Ayers in an impossible position. In any case, we were back at square one, and the whole world knew it. The only good news was that on December 10th, Pat Cipollone started as White House counsel, not a minute too soon. Mattis's departure soon became highly public. Many candidates, inside and outside, vied for the chief of staff role, but Trump tweeted on December 14th that Mick Mulvaney, director of the Office of Management and Budget, would be acting chief of staff once Kelly left. Kushner came by that afternoon to say he was delighted at the decision and that the acting part of the title was just a charade. As I pieced things together later, there were no real negotiations between Trump and Mulvaney over the terms of the job, so the decision struck me as somewhat impulsive. Pompeo thought Mulvaney would do essentially whatever Ivanka and Kushner wanted him to do, which worried both of us philosophically. The handover from Kelly to Mulvaney was effective January 2nd. In an October 2019 interview in the midst of the Ukraine impeachment crisis, Kelly said he had told Trump, "Whatever you do," and we were still in the process of trying to find someone to take my place, I said, "Whatever you do, don't hire a yes man, someone who won't tell you the truth. Don't do that, because if you do, I believe you will be impeached." Trump flatly denied Kelly had made such a statement. John Kelly never said that. He never said anything like that. If he would have said that, I would have thrown him out of the office. He just wants to come back into the action like everybody else does. And Stephanie Grisham, previously one of the First Lady's Furies, now White House press secretary, pronounced ex cathedra, "I worked with John Kelly, and he was totally unequipped to handle the genius of our great president." These quotes speak volumes about the people who uttered them. With Kelly's departure and Mulvaney's appointment, all effective efforts at managing the executive office of the president ceased. Both domestic policy strategy and political strategy, never strong suits, all but disappeared. Personnel decisions deteriorated further, and the general chaos spread. The crisis over Ukraine followed. There was a lot of evidence that Kelly's hypothesis was entirely correct. Chapter 9. Venezuela Libre. Venezuela's illegitimate regime, one of the Western Hemisphere's most oppressive, presented the Trump administration an opportunity. But it required steady determination on our part and consistent, all-out, unrelenting pressure. We failed to meet this standard. The president vacillated and wobbled, exacerbating internal administration disagreements rather than resolving them, and repeatedly impeding our efforts to carry out a policy. We were never overconfident of success supporting the Venezuelan opposition's efforts to replace Nicolas Maduro, Hugo Chávez's heir. It was almost the opposite. Maduro's opponents acted in January 2019 because they felt strongly this could be their last opportunity for freedom after years of trying and failing. America responded because it was in our national interest to do so. It still is, and the struggle continues. After the unsuccessful efforts to oust Maduro, the Trump administration did not hesitate to discuss publicly in detail how close the opposition had come to ousting Maduro and what had gone wrong. Numerous press stories repeated details of what we had continuously heard from the opposition during 2019 and which are discussed in this text. This was hardly a normal situation of diplomatic conversations and exchanges, and we heard as well from many members of Congress and private U.S. citizens, especially members of the Cuban-American and Venezuelan-American communities in Florida. Someday, when Venezuela is free again, the many individuals supporting the opposition will be free to tell their stories publicly. Until then, we have only the memories of people like myself fortunate enough to be able to tell their stories for them. There is a 2-decade-long history of missed opportunities in Venezuela, given the widespread, strongly held opposition to the Chavez-Maduro regime. Shortly after I became National Security Advisor, while Maduro was speaking at a military awards ceremony on August 4th, he was attacked by 2 drones. While the attack failed, it showed vigorous dissent within the military. And the hilarious pictures of service members fleeing energetically at the sound of explosions, despite regime propaganda, showed just how loyal the military was to Maduro. Maduro's autocratic regime was a threat due to its Cuba connection and the openings it afforded Russia, China, and Iran. Moscow's menace was undeniable, both military and financial, having expended substantial resources to buttress Maduro, dominate Venezuela's oil and gas industry, and impose costs on the U.S. Beijing was not far behind. Trump saw this, telling me after a New Year's Day 2019 call with Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi that he worried about Russia and China. I don't want to be sitting around watching. Venezuela hadn't topped my priorities when I started, but competent national security management requires flexibility when new threats or opportunities arise. Venezuela was just such a contingency. America had opposed external threats in the Western Hemisphere since the Monroe Doctrine, and it was time to resurrect it after the Obama-Kerry efforts to bury it. Venezuela was a threat on its own account, as demonstrated in a December 22nd incident at sea along the Guyana-Venezuela border. Venezuelan naval units tried to board ExxonMobil exploration ships under licenses from Guyana in its territorial waters. Chavez and Maduro had run Venezuela's oil and gas industry into a ditch, and extensive hydrocarbon resources in Guyana would pose an immediate competitive threat right next door. The incident evaporated as the exploration ships, after refusing Venezuelan requests to land a chopper on board one of them, headed rapidly back into undeniably Guyanese waters. Shortly after the drone attack, during an unrelated meeting on August 15th, Venezuela came up, and Trump said to me emphatically, "Get it done," meaning get rid of the Maduro regime. "This is the 5th time I've asked for it," he continued. I described the thinking we were doing, in a meeting now slimmed down to just Kelly and me, but Trump insisted he wanted military options for Venezuela and then keep it, because it's really part of the United States. This presidential interest in discussing military options initially surprised me, but it shouldn't have. As I learned, Trump had previously advocated it, responding to a press question almost exactly 1 year earlier on August 11, 2017, at Bedminster, New Jersey. "We have many options for Venezuela, and by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option. We have many options for Venezuela. This is our neighbor. We're all over the world, and we have troops all over the world in places that are very, very far away. Venezuela is not very far away, and the people are suffering, and they're dying. We have many options for Venezuela, including a possible military option if necessary." I explained why military force was not the answer, especially given the inevitable congressional opposition, but that we could accomplish the same objective by working with Maduro's opponents. I subsequently decided to turn a spotlight on Venezuela, giving a widely covered speech in Miami on November 1, 2018, in which I condemned the Western Hemisphere's troika of tyranny: Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. I announced that the administration, in its ongoing reversal of Obama's Cuba policy, would impose new sanctions against Havana and also carry out a new executive order sanctioning Venezuela's gold sector, which the regime used to keep itself afloat by selling gold from Venezuela's central bank. The Troika of Tyranny speech underlined the affiliations between all three authoritarian governments, laying the basis for a more forward-leaning policy. Trump liked the phrase Troika of Tyranny, telling me, "You give such great speeches." This one, as I pointed out, had been written by one of his own speechwriters. Of course, Trump also periodically said that he wanted to meet with Maduro to resolve all our problems with Venezuela, which neither Pompeo nor I thought was a good idea. At one point in December, I ran into Rudy Giuliani in the West Wing. He asked to come see me after a meeting of Trump's lawyers, which was why he was there. He had a message for Trump from Representative Pete Sessions, who had long advocated Trump meet with Maduro, as had Senator Bob Corker, for reasons best known to themselves. Discussing this later, Pompeo suggested we first send someone to Venezuela to see Maduro, although as Trump's interest in talking with Maduro waned thereafter, nothing happened. The big bang in Venezuela came on Friday, January 11th. The new young president of the National Assembly, Juan Guaidó, announced at a huge rally in Caracas that the Assembly believed Maduro's manifestly fraudulent 2018 re-election was illegitimate and therefore invalid. Accordingly, the Assembly, Venezuela's only legitimate, popularly elected institution, had declared the Venezuelan presidency vacant. Under the vacancy clause of Hugo Chávez's own constitution, Guaidó said he would become interim president on January 23rd, which was the anniversary of the 1958 military coup that overthrew the Marcos Pérez Jiménez dictatorship and oust Maduro to prepare new elections. The U.S. had only late word the National Assembly would move in this direction. We played no role in encouraging or assisting the opposition. They saw this moment as possibly their last chance. It was now all on the line in Venezuela, and we had to decide how to respond. Sit and watch or act? I had no doubt what we should do. The revolution was on. I told Mauricio Claver Carón, whom I had recently chosen as NSC Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere, to issue a statement of support. I briefed Trump on what had happened, interrupting a meeting with an outsider that had already run past its scheduled end. Trump, though, was irritated at being informed of only a possible change in Venezuela, saying I should put the statement out in my name, not his. I could have reminded him he had said not 10 days before, "I don't want to be sitting around watching," and probably should have, but I just issued the statement as my own. Maduro reacted harshly, threatening National Assembly members and their families. Guaidó himself was arrested by one of the regime's secret police forces, but then quickly released. There was speculation it was actually Cubans who seized Guaidó, but his release indicated real confusion in the regime, a good sign. I also tweeted the first of many Venezuela tweets to come condemning the Maduro dictatorship's arrest of Guaidó. I was heartened that Maduro's government promptly accused me of leading a coup against Venezuela's democracy, an approach followed by other adversaries who attacked Trump's advisors. More important, we began devising steps to take immediately against Maduro's regime, and also Cuba, its protector and likely controller, and Nicaragua. Why not go after all three at once? Oil sanctions were a natural choice, but why not declare Venezuela a state sponsor of terrorism, something I first suggested on October 1st, 2018, and also return Cuba to the list after Obama had removed it? Under Chavez and now Maduro, Venezuela's revenues from petroleum-related exports had dropped dramatically as production itself fell from approximately 3.3 million barrels of oil pumped per day when Chavez took power in 1999 to approximately 1.1 million barrels per day in January 2019. This precipitous decline, dropping Venezuela to production levels not seen since the 1940s, had already substantially impoverished the country. Driving the state-owned oil monopoly's production as low as possible, which the opposition fully supported, might well have been enough to crash Maduro's regime. There were many other sanctions necessary to eliminate the regime's illicit income streams, especially drug trafficking with narco-terrorists operating primarily in Colombia with safe havens in Venezuela, but striking the oil company was key. On January 14th, I convened a principals committee in the sit room to consider our options for sanctioning the Maduro regime, especially the petroleum sector. I thought it was time to turn the screws and asked, why don't we go for a win here? It rapidly became clear that everyone wanted to take decisive action except Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. He wanted to do little or nothing, arguing that if we acted, it risked Maduro's nationalizing what little remained of U.S. oil sector investments in Venezuela and raising international oil prices. Mnuchin essentially wanted a guarantee we would succeed, with Maduro overthrown if we imposed sanctions. That, of course, was impossible. If I have one memory of Mnuchin from the administration, and there were many carbon copies of this one, Mnuchin opposing tough measures, especially against China, this is it. Why were our sanctions often not as sweeping and effective as they might have been? Listen no further. As Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, a renowned financier much more politically conservative than Mnuchin, who was basically a Democrat, said to me in April, Stephen's more worried about secondary effects on U.S. companies than about the mission, which was completely accurate. Mnuchin's argument for passivity was entirely economic, so it was important that Larry Kudlow weighed in quickly to say, John's view is my view too. Keith Kellogg added that Pence believed we should be going all out against Venezuela's state-owned oil company. That had enormous effect, since Pence rarely offered his views in such settings to avoid boxing in the president. Pompeo was traveling, but Deputy Secretary of State John Sullivan argued for sanctions, although not with great specificity. Energy Secretary Rick Perry was strongly in favor of tough sanctions, sweeping aside Mnuchin's concerns about the limited U.S. oil and gas assets in Venezuela. Mnuchin was a minority of one, so I said we should send Trump a split decision memo. Everyone should get their arguments in quickly because we were moving fast. Pence had earlier offered to call Guaido to express our support, which, after hearing Mnuchin, I thought was a good idea. The call went well, increasing the urgency that America react with something more than just rhetoric praising Venezuela's National Assembly. Nonetheless, Mnuchin kept up his campaign for doing nothing. Pompeo told me he had a 30-minute call with Mnuchin on Thursday and had counterproposed doing the sanctions in slices. I responded that we had a shot to overthrow Maduro now, and it might be a long, long time before we had another one as good. Half measures weren't going to cut it. Pompeo agreed we didn't want to replicate Obama in 2009, watching pro-democracy protests in Iran suppressed while the U.S. did nothing. That sounded like Pompeo was moving in the right direction. Even the Organization of American States, long one of the most moribund international organizations, and that's saying something, was roused to help Guaido as a growing number of Latin American countries stood up to declare support for Venezuela's defiant National Assembly. The mere fact Guaido remained free showed we had a chance. We needed Trump's decision on sanctions and whether to recognize Guaido as the legitimate interim president when he crossed the Rubicon on January 23rd. On the 21st, I explained to Trump the possible political and economic steps to take against Maduro and said a lot depended on what happened 2 days later. Trump doubted Maduro would fall, saying he's too smart and too tough, which was yet another surprise given earlier comments on the regime's stability. He had said just a short time before, on September 25, 2018, in New York, that it's a regime that, frankly, could be toppled very quickly by the military if the military decides to do that. Trump added that he also wanted the fullest range of options against the regime, which request I conveyed to Dunford later in the day. Dunford and I also discussed what might be required if things went badly in Caracas, potentially endangering the lives of official U.S. personnel and even private U.S. citizens there, thereby perhaps necessitating a non-permissive evacuation of those in danger. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the decision on political recognition was more important now than the oil sanctions. First, U.S. recognition would have major implications for the Federal Reserve Board and therefore banks worldwide. The Fed would automatically turn control over Venezuelan government assets it possessed to the Guaidó-led administration. Unfortunately, as we were to find, Maduro's regime had been so proficient at stealing or squandering those assets, there weren't many left. But the international financial consequences of recognition were nonetheless significant, since other central banks and private bankers weren't looking for reasons to be on the Fed's bad side. Second, the logic of sanctioning the country's oil monopoly and other measures Mnuchin and Treasury were resisting would become unanswerable once we endorsed Guaidó's legitimacy. To that end, I scheduled an 8 a.m. meeting on January 22nd with Pompeo, Mnuchin, Wilbur Ross, and Kudlow. Inside Venezuela, tensions were rising. In the hours before we met, there had been all-night demonstrations, including cacerolazos, the traditional gatherings to bang pots and pans in the poorest areas of Caracas, the original base of Chavista support. Shortages of basic goods were increasing, and demonstrators had briefly seized control of the roads to the Caracas airport. Only colectivos, the armed gangs of motorcycle thugs used by Chavez and Maduro to sow terror and intimidate the opposition, and which the opposition believed were equipped and directed by the Cubans, appeared to reopen the roads. No military. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino, one of many Latins with Russian first names from Cold War days, and Foreign Minister Jorge Arriaza had both already approached the opposition, tentatively exploring what the National Assembly's amnesty for defecting military officers would mean if the opposition prevailed. Nonetheless, after years of hostility between the two sides, there was real mistrust within Venezuelan society. With this backdrop, I asked if we should recognize Guaidó when the National Assembly declared him interim president. Ross spoke first, saying it was clear we should support Guaidó, immediately seconded by Kudlow and Pompeo. Happily, Mnuchin concurred, saying we had already asserted that Maduro was illegitimate, so recognizing Guaidó was simply the next logical step. We didn't discuss what the economic consequences would be. Either Mnuchin didn't see the connection, or he didn't want to fight the issue. I was fine either way. With recognition resolved, we discussed other steps, working with the informal Lima group of Latin American nations for them to recognize Guaidó, which took little or no convincing, adjusting the level of our travel advisory warnings, considering how to oust the Cubans, and handling the Russian paramilitaries reportedly arriving to protect Maduro. I considered the meeting a total victory. Later in the morning, I spoke with Trump, who now wanted assurances regarding post-Maduro access to Venezuela's oil resources, trying to ensure that China and Russia would not continue to benefit from their deals with the illicit Chavez-Maduro regime. Trump, as usual, was having trouble distinguishing responsible measures to protect legitimate American interests from what amounted to vast overreaching of the sort no other government, especially a democratic one, would even consider. I suggested Pence raise the issue with Guaidó in the call being scheduled for later in the day, and Trump agreed. I also called several members of Florida's congressional delegation who were coming to see Trump on Venezuela that afternoon, so they were prepared if the oil field issue arose. Senators Marco Rubio and Rick Scott and Congressman Lincoln Diaz-Balart and Ron DeSantis gave very forceful support for toppling Maduro, with Rubio saying, "This may be the last chance," and that success would be a big foreign policy win. During the meeting, they explained that the National Assembly believed many Russian and Chinese business deals had been procured through bribes and corruption, making them easy to invalidate once a new government was installed. The discussion was very helpful, and Trump agreed unequivocally to recognize Guaido, which Pence, who was attending the meeting, was fully prepared to do. Trump later added unhelpfully, "I want him to say he will be extremely loyal to the United States and no one else." Trump still wanted a military option, raising the question with the Florida Republicans, who were plainly stunned, except for Rubio, who had heard it before and knew how to deflect it politely. Later, I called Shanahan and Dunford to ask how their thinking was proceeding. None of us thought that a military option was advisable at this point. To me, this exercise was solely to keep Trump interested in the objective of overthrowing Maduro, without actually wasting a lot of time on a non-starter. The Pentagon would have to begin at square one, because under the Obama administration, Secretary of State John Kerry had announced the end of the Monroe Doctrine, a mistake that had reverberated through all of the national security departments and agencies with predictable effects. But it is proof of what some people thought was a joke when Trump later commented that I had to hold him back. He was correct on Venezuela. Dunford said politely at the end of our call that he appreciated my trying to help him understand how our military's involvement might arise. Of course, I had the easy job, closing by saying, all I had to do was make the call. Now, Dunford had the problem. He laughed and said, "Tag, I'm it." At least he still had a sense of humor. Pence asked me to join him in his office for the Guaido call, which went through about 6:15. Guaido was very appreciative of a supportive video Pence had distributed earlier over the internet, and the two had an excellent talk. Pence again expressed our support, and Guaido answered positively, if very generally, about how the opposition would perform if it prevailed. He said that Venezuela was very happy with the support the United States was providing and would work hand in hand with us, given the risks we were taking. I felt this should satisfy Trump. After the call, I leaned over Pence's desk to shake hands, saying, "This is a historic moment." He suggested we go to the Oval to brief Trump, who was quite happy with the outcome, looking forward to the statement he would make the next day. He called me about 9:25 a.m. on the 23rd to say the draft statement to be issued when the National Assembly formally invoked the Venezuelan Constitution to move against Maduro was beautiful, adding, "I almost never say that." I thanked him and said we would keep him posted. Guaido appeared before a huge crowd in Caracas, according to our embassy, the largest in the 20-year history of the Chavez-Maduro regime, and took the oath of office as interim president. The die was cast. Pence came in to shake hands, and we issued Trump's statement immediately. We feared the imminent deployment of troops, but none came, although reports indicated that overnight, colectivos killed 4 people. Embassy Caracas presented its credentials to the new Guaido government, along with the Lima Group ambassadors, as a show of support. I briefed Trump on the day's events at about 6:30 p.m., and he seemed to be holding firm. The next day, Defense Minister Padrino and an array of generals held a press conference to declare loyalty to Maduro, which was not what we wanted, but which to this point was not reflected in actual military activity. The opposition believed that 80% or more of the rank and file, as well as most junior officers whose families were enduring the same hardships as Venezuela's civilian population generally, supported the new government. While the percentage figure cannot be confirmed given the authoritarian nature of the Maduro regime, Guaido frequently contended he had the support of 90% of Venezuela's population overall. Top military officers, like those at the press conference, however, were likely still too corrupted by years of Chavista rule to break ranks. On the other hand, they had not ordered the military out of their barracks to crush the rebellion, likely fearing such an order would be disobeyed, which would be the end of the regime. UK Foreign Minister Jeremy Hunt, in Washington for meetings, was delighted to cooperate on steps they could take, for example, freezing Venezuelan gold deposits in the Bank of England so the regime could not sell the gold to keep itself going. These were the sorts of steps we were already applying to pressure Maduro financially. I urged Pompeo to have state more fully support the effort against the state-owned oil company, where I still worried Mnuchin was holding out, which he agreed to do. Pompeo was also disturbed by signs Maduro might be encouraging the colectivos to threaten U.S. embassy personnel, and said Trump was as well. The first troubling sign from Trump came that evening after 8:30 p.m. when he called to say, "I don't like where we are," referring to Venezuela. He worried about Padrino's press conference, saying, "The entire army is behind him." Then he added, "I've always said Maduro was tough. This kid, Guaido, nobody's ever heard of him. And the Russians have put out brutal statements." I walked Trump back off the ledge, explaining that the military was still in its barracks, which was very significant, and that senior military figures had been talking to the opposition for 2 days about what could be in it for them if they came over to the opposition or retired. Things were still very much in play, and the more time passed, the more likely it was that the military would fragment, which was what we really needed. I don't think I satisfied Trump, but I at least talked him back into silence. God only knew who he was talking to or whether he had just gotten a case of the vapors because things were still uncertain. I was sure of one thing. Any display of American indecision now would doom the entire effort. I suspected Trump knew that too, but I was amazed our policy was so close to shifting just 30-plus hours after being launched. You couldn't make this up. The next morning, I called Pompeo to tell him how Trump had all but jumped ship on Venezuela and to make sure Pompeo wasn't about to follow. Fortunately, I heard exactly the opposite reaction, Pompeo saying, "We should go to the wall to get Maduro out." Encouraged, I later asked Claver Carone to follow up with Guaido's people to ensure that they were getting out letters, the sooner the better, to the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, and similar institutions announcing that they were the legitimate government. Pompeo thought there was a way forward on the safety of U.S. personnel in Caracas, thus allowing us to retain a slimmed-down mission, which he wanted to do. I explained how state often became so hung up on safety issues that it made concessions on policy issues, arguing it was required to protect official staff. I certainly wasn't arguing for ignoring risks to our people, but I did believe it was better to withdraw them rather than make substantive concessions to governments like Maduro's. Just after 9 a.m., I called Trump, finding him in somewhat better shape than the night before. He still thought the opposition was beaten down, referring again to the picture of Padrino and all those good-looking generals declaring support for Maduro. I told him the real pressure was about to begin, as we imposed the petroleum sanctions, taking away a significant share of the regime's revenues. "Do it," said Trump, which was the clear signal I needed to roll over Treasury if it was still obstructionist. On our Caracas diplomatic personnel, however, Trump wanted them all out, fearing the blowback if anything went wrong. Mostly, however, he seemed uninterested, which was explained later in the day when he announced a partial deal ending the government shutdown, interpreted across the political spectrum as a complete surrender on his Mexico border wall project. No wonder he was in a grumpy mood. I decided to call Mnuchin, who for some reason was in California again, and he agreed we had to apply oil sanctions now that we've acknowledged the new regime. I called Pompeo to tell him the good news, and he said Venezuela's foreign minister was coming to New York for the Saturday UN Security Council debate we and others had asked for. We both thought this might be an opportunity for Pompeo to see him alone and get a clear assessment of his state of mind without flunkies nearby to listen in, similar to what we were doing with other Venezuelans in diplomatic missions around the world. Because of the near certainty of Russian and probably Chinese vetoes, we didn't expect anything substantive from the Security Council, but it was a good forum to generate support for the opposition cause. Guaidó helped out later in the day by calling on Cuba to take its people out of Venezuela and send them home. On Saturday, January 26th, the Security Council met at 9 a.m., and Pompeo laced into the Maduro regime. The European members said Maduro had 8 days to call elections or they would all recognize Guaidó, a considerable improvement over what we thought the EU position was. Russia blasted the meeting as an attempted coup and denounced me personally for calling for a Bolshevik-style expropriation in Venezuela. An honor, thereby showing we were on the right track going after the oil monopoly. Potentially significant was news that Venezuela's military attaché in Washington had declared his allegiance to Guaidó. These and other defections brought the opposition new advocates, which, as a standard procedure, the opposition now asked to persuade officers and civilian officials still in Venezuela to bring as many of them around as he could. Unfortunately, the State Department was in a tizzy over the assurances it wanted from Maduro about the safety of our diplomatic personnel. This was not about the substance of ensuring Venezuela's government provided adequate protection, but about how to exchange diplomatic notes, completely oblivious to the broader political context. State had also held up notifying the Federal Reserve we had recognized a new government in Caracas, which was stunning. By Monday, State's Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau was in open revolt against petroleum sanctions, arguing, as I had feared, that so doing would endanger embassy personnel. Western Hemisphere Affairs Assistant Secretary Kim Breyer wanted a 30-day delay in the sanctions, which was palpable nonsense. At first, I didn't take it seriously, but Breyer's argument seemed to be expanding by the day, with essentially anything we did to put pressure on the Maduro regime leaving our embassy staff, most of whom by then were security personnel, not diplomats, in danger. If I were just a tad more cynical, I might have concluded Breyer and her bureau were actually trying to subvert our basic policy. Pompeo called me Saturday afternoon, uncertain about what to do about the bureaucracy's resistance. I persuaded him that the Western Hemisphere Bureau was simply playing for time. Whatever delay he agreed to would only form the basis for the next request for delay. He agreed, finally, that he was okay if we went tomorrow on the sanctions, which we did. Nonetheless, the Bureau's rebellion was not a good sign. Who knew what the bureaucracy was telling other governments, the strong left-wing Latin America think tank lobby presence in Washington, and the media? Mnuchin and I spoke several times on Monday. He had talked to oil company executives all weekend, and the sanctions would actually be more aggressive than he had first anticipated, which was good news. Predictions we could not act against the state-owned oil company because of negative impacts on Gulf Coast refiners turned out to be overstated. Having appreciated the possibility of petroleum sanctions for years, these refineries were well-positioned, in Mnuchin's words, to find other sources of oil. Imports from Venezuela were already less than 10% of their total work. In the afternoon, we were to unveil the sanctions in the White House briefing room, but I got diverted to the Oval first. Trump was very happy with how the Venezuela thing was playing in the press. He asked if we should send 5,000 troops to Colombia in case they might be needed, which I duly noted on my yellow legal pad, saying I would check with the Pentagon. "Go have fun with the press," Trump said, which we did, when my note, picked up by cameras, produced endless speculation. A few weeks later, Colombian Foreign Minister Carlos Trujillo brought me a pack of legal pads like the one I had in the briefing room, so I didn't run out. Substantively, we believed that the oil sanctions were a major blow to Maduro's regime, and many asserted that it was now just a matter of time before he fell. Their optimism was high, fueled in substantial part because they believed Maduro loyalists like Diosdado Cabello and others were sending both their financial assets and their families abroad for safety, hardly a vote of confidence in the regime. On January 30th, my office filled with people, including Sarah Sanders, Bill Shine, and Mercedes Schlapp, to listen to Trump's call to Guaido at about 9 a.m. Trump wished him good luck on the large anti-Maduro demonstrations planned for later in the day, which Trump said were historic. Trump then assured Guaido he'd pull off Maduro's overthrow and offered as an aside that he was sure Guaido would remember in the future what had happened, which was Trump's way of referring to his interest in Venezuela's oil fields. It was a big moment in the history of the world, said Trump. Guaido thanked Trump for his calls for democracy and his firm leadership, which made me smile. Firm? If only he knew. Trump said Guaido should feel free to tell the rallies later in the day he had called, and that he looked forward to meeting Guaido personally. Guaido responded that it would be very, very moving for the people to hear that he had spoken to Trump when they fight against the dictatorship. Trump said it was an honor to talk to him, and the call ended. It was undoubtedly a boost to Guaido to announce he had spoken with Trump, which of course is what we intended. Guaido tweeted about the call even before Trump did, and the press coverage was uniformly favorable. At 1:30 p.m., I met with American executives of the Citgo Petroleum Corporation, which is majority-owned by Venezuela's state-owned oil company, to tell them we supported their efforts and those of the Venezuelan opposition to keep control of Citgo's refineries and service stations in the United States, thereby shielding them from Maduro's efforts to assert control. As I explained to them and others, we were also providing advice to Guaido at his request in his efforts to nominate people to the oil company's various boards of directors, which, through subsidiaries, ultimately held Citgo's ownership. I referred the executives to Wilbur Ross, whom they met the next day, for advice on avoiding the effects of a Russian government lien on Venezuela's oil company's stock that might lead to a loss of control over the U.S. assets, which was right down his alley. From Moscow, we learned that Putin was allegedly very concerned about the roughly $18 billion Venezuela owed to Moscow. The estimates of the actual amounts owed varied widely, but they were all substantial. The U.S. executives told me that earlier in the day, Venezuelans loyal to Maduro, having tried unsuccessfully to divert corporate assets before they left, had fled the U.S. with one of Citgo's corporate jets headed for Caracas. I was sure we could expect more of this in the days ahead. Even Lukoil, the big Russian firm, announced it was suspending operations with Venezuela's oil monopoly, which reflected at least some desire by Russia to hedge its bets. A few days later, PetroChina, a major Chinese operation, announced it was dropping the oil monopoly as a partner for a Chinese refinery project, thus showing significant unease. Subsequently, Gazprombank, Russia's third biggest lender, closely tied to Putin and the Kremlin, froze its accounts to avoid running afoul of our sanctions. We believed Guaido and the opposition would take the opportunity to speak with Russian and Chinese diplomats and business types, stressing it was in their interest not to take sides in the intra-Venezuelan dispute. Within the U.S. government, we were also planning for the day after in Venezuela and considering what could be done to get the country's economy, in terrible disarray after 2 decades of economic mismanagement, which even Putin disparaged, back on its feet. We gave significant thought to how we could help a new government face both immediate needs for the people and also the longer-term need to repair the systemic destruction of what should have been one of Latin America's strongest economies. A drumbeat of diplomatic recognitions of Guaido was picking up, and we hoped it would demonstrate even to Maduro loyalists that his days were numbered, and also provide insurance against arrest for Guaido and other opposition leaders. This was not hypothetical. Maduro's secret police broke into Guaido's home and threatened his wife and young daughter. They were not harmed, but the signal was clear. It looked very much like a Cuban-directed operation, underscoring again that the foreign presence in Venezuela, Cuban and Russian alike, was critical to keeping Maduro in power. Protests continued throughout the country, undeterred by the prospect of Maduro's cracking down. Continuous contacts were being made with top military officers about the terms under which they could come to Guaido's side, and with former Chavista cabinet members, labor union leaders, and other sectors of Venezuelan society to build alliances. We thought the momentum remained with the opposition, but they needed to pick up the pace. In Venezuela, a plan was being developed which we thought promising to bring humanitarian supplies across the borders from Colombia and Brazil to distribute around Venezuela. Until now, Maduro had effectively closed the borders, feasible because difficult terrain and thick forests and jungles made crossings all but impossible except at well-known and established border checkpoints. The humanitarian aid project would demonstrate Guaido's concerns for Venezuela's people and also show that the international borders were open, reflecting Maduro's increasing lack of control. There were also hopes that key military officials would not follow orders to close the borders, but that even if they did, Maduro would be placed in the impossible position of denying humanitarian supplies to his impoverished citizens. Maduro was so troubled by this strategy that he again took to criticizing me by name, saying, "I have proof that the assassination attempt was ordered by John Bolton in the White House." He was joined by Foreign Minister Arriaza, who complained, "What he's trying to do here is give us orders." Cuba was also now attacking me by name, so my spirits were high. Colombian President Iván Duque visited Trump in the White House on February 13th, and the discussion centered on Venezuela. Trump asked the Colombians if he should have talked to Maduro 6 months earlier, and Duque said unequivocally it would have been a big victory for Maduro, implying it would be an even bigger mistake to talk to him now. Trump said he agreed, which relieved me greatly. He then inquired how the effort was going overall and whether the momentum was with Maduro or Guaido. Here, Colombian Ambassador Francisco Santos was particularly effective, saying that even 2 months ago he would have said Maduro had the edge, but he no longer believed it was true, explaining why. This clearly registered with Trump. Nonetheless, I worried our own government was not displaying a proper sense of urgency. There was, across the government, an obstructionist, not-invented-here mentality, undoubtedly in large part because under 8 years of Obama, the Venezuelan, Cuban, and Nicaraguan regimes were not seen as U.S. adversaries. Little or no attention was given to what the U.S. should do if, inconveniently, the people of these countries decided they wanted to run their own governments. Even more important, in my view, the growing Russian, Chinese, Iranian, and Cuban influence across the hemisphere had not been a priority. In effect, therefore, the Trump administration faced an avalanche of due bills in Latin America with no preparation for how to handle them. The opposition refined its thinking on how to force humanitarian aid into Venezuela from Colombia and Brazil and set Saturday, February 23rd as the target date. The Saturday prior, some 600,000 people had signed up in Caracas to help. After much coordinating between the United States Agency for International Development and the Pentagon, C-17 cargo planes were now landing at Cúcuta, one of the principal Colombian border crossing points, offloading humanitarian assistance to go across the bridges connecting the two countries. Inside Venezuela, movement toward the opposition continued. The Catholic Bishop of San Cristobal, who was also vice president of the country's Catholic Bishops' Conference, spoke publicly, specifically referring to a transition in power away from Maduro. We had hoped the Church would take a more active public role, and that now seemed to be happening. As February 23rd approached, rumors intensified of a high-level military leader, likely Venezuelan Army Commander Jesus Suarez Churrio, publicly announcing that he no longer backed Maduro. There had been similar rumors before, but the humanitarian cross-border plan was the key factor why this time it might be true. Contemporaneously, Senator Marco Rubio specifically named Suarez Churrio, along with Defense Minister Padrino and 4 others, as key military figures who could receive amnesty if they defected to the opposition. There was also some feeling that defections of this magnitude would bring a significant number of troops with them, with the military units seemingly moving toward the borders, but then doubling back to Caracas to encircle Miraflores Palace, Venezuela's White House. These optimistic forecasts, however, did not come to pass. We were doing our bit, with a Trump speech at Miami's Florida International University on February 18th, which could have been a campaign rally, so enthusiastic was the crowd. Plans for the 23rd fell into place, as Colombia's President Duque announced he would be joined at Cúcuta by the presidents of Panama, Chile, and Paraguay, and the Organization of American States Secretary General Luis Almagro. This would prove convincingly that Venezuela's revolution was hardly made in Washington. Humanitarian supplies increased on the borders, and there was evidence that Maduro's security forces intensified their harassment of non-governmental organizations inside the country. Guaidó left Caracas under cover on Wednesday, heading for the Colombian border where, it was originally planned, he would wait on the Venezuelan side while the humanitarian aid came from Tienditas International Bridge from Colombia. We heard, however, that Guaidó was thinking of actually crossing into Colombia to attend a Richard Branson-sponsored concert in Cúcuta on Friday night to support the assistance to Venezuela, and then leading the aid back across the border the next day, facing a confrontation with Maduro's forces, if one came, directly. This was not a good idea, for several reasons. It was very dramatic, but dangerous, not just physically, but more important, politically. Once across the border and outside Venezuela, it would likely be difficult for Guaidó to get back in. What would happen to his ability to direct and control opposition policy if he were isolated outside the country, subject to Maduro propaganda saying he had fled in fear? We had no way of predicting the outcome on Saturday. It could swing from one extreme to another. Things could go well, with the border effectively opened, which would be a direct challenge to Maduro's authority, or there could be violence and bloodshed at the crossing points, potentially with Guaidó arrested or worse. I thought trying to bring the humanitarian aid across the border was well conceived and entirely doable. More grandiose plans, however, were not well thought out and could easily lead to trouble. In the midst of all this, with the Trump-Kim Jong-un Hanoi summit looming, I cut short my planned itinerary in Asia, canceling meetings in Korea so I could stay in Washington until Sunday to see what happened in Venezuela. Although media attention focused on the Colombia-Venezuela border, especially at Cúcuta, there were also significant developments on the Brazil side. The Pimones, indigenous people inside Venezuela who detested Maduro, were fighting the government's National Guard forces. Both sides sustained casualties, and the Pimones reportedly captured 27 guardsmen, including one general, and burned an airport checkpoint. By Friday, the Pimones also took control of several roads leading into Venezuela. Later on Friday, Guaidó crossed into Colombia reportedly via helicopter, assisted by sympathetic members of Venezuela's military. These troops were also expected to help get the humanitarian aid through the border checkpoints on Saturday. I was disappointed, but at least we heard that night that Richard Branson's concert was much better attended than a competing Maduro concert inside Venezuela, which I guess was a victory of sorts. Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, announced that all border crossing points would be closed on Saturday, but we had conflicting information on what exactly was closed and what might still be open. Saturday morning, large crowds massed on the Colombian side of the border, with riot police in Táchira on the Venezuelan side. Low-level violence continued on the Brazilian border as crowds gathered there as well. Aid supplies had been building for weeks at several checkpoints on both borders, and additional convoys were prepared to arrive at the checkpoints throughout the day, escorted across by volunteers from Colombia or Brazil to be met on the other side by Venezuelan volunteers. At least, that was the plan. Incidents of rock throwing, confrontations with the Venezuelan National Guard, and barricades being moved and replaced increased throughout the day as the times for the attempted crossings drew near. Several mid-level Army and Navy officers defected, and there were reports that National Guardsmen along the border were defecting as well. Guaido arrived at the Tienditas International Bridge about 9 a.m., prepared to cross. There were reports all day that he was about to cross, but it didn't happen, without real explanations. In fact, the operation simply fizzled out, with exceptions at some places where volunteers tried to bring aid across. They succeeded on the Brazil border, but not so on the Colombia border. The Pimones were still the most aggressive, seizing the biggest airport in the Brazilian border region and capturing more National Guard troops. But between the colectivos and some National Guard units, the level of violence against attempted border crossings rose, and the level of aid getting through did not. There were large demonstrations in Venezuela's cities, planned to coincide with the humanitarian aid coming in, including outside La Carlota military base in Caracas, with the crowds trying to convince servicemen to defect, unfortunately without success. By the end of Saturday, I thought the opposition had done little to advance its cause. I was disappointed the military had not responded with more defections, especially at senior levels. And I was amazed Guaido and Colombia did not execute alternative plans when the colectivos and others stopped aid shipments from coming in, burning trucks on the bridges. Things seemed haphazard and disconnected. Whether through lack of advanced planning or failure of nerve, I couldn't immediately tell. But if things didn't pick up in the next few days and Guaido didn't get back to Caracas, I was going to start getting worried. We were hearing that among Venezuelans, the feeling was that Saturday had been a victory for Guaido, which struck me as very optimistic. We learned much later that there was speculation that the Colombians had gotten cold feet, fearing a military clash along the border would draw them in, and that after years of fighting counter-insurgency and counter-narcotics wars inside Colombia, their troops simply weren't ready for conventional conflict with Maduro's armed forces. Nobody figured this out until Saturday? Guaido was in Bogotá by mid-afternoon, preparing for Monday's Lima Group meeting. I still didn't like the idea of Guaido's crossing the border in the first place, let alone hanging out in Colombia for several days, which Maduro used to propagandize that Guaido was seeking aid from Venezuela's traditional adversary. I spoke to Pence, who was heading to Bogotá to represent the U.S. to the Lima Group, and stressed the need to persuade Guaido to return to Caracas. A key element of the opposition's success so far was its cohesion, whereas in the past it had always fragmented. Every day Guaido was out of the country increased the risk Maduro would find a way to split them again. Pence agreed and said he would be meeting Guaido in a trilateral with Duque. I also urged Pence to press for more sanctions against the Maduro regime to show it had to pay a price for blocking the humanitarian aid. Trump had said at the Miami rally that the Venezuelan generals had to make a choice, and Pence could say he was elaborating on Trump's point. I briefed Trump Sunday afternoon, but he seemed unconcerned, which surprised me. He was impressed by the number of defections from the military, which within a few days would be close to 500. I suspected his mind was on North Korea and the upcoming Hanoi summit. As the call ended, he said, "Okay, man," which was his usual signal he was pleased with what he had heard. As I flew to Hanoi, I spoke again with Pence on his way back to Washington after a firm speech in Bogota to the Lima Group, who said there was tremendous spirit in the room, which was encouraging. Guaido had impressed him. Very genuine, very smart, and he gave an extremely strong speech in front of the Lima Group. I urged Pence to pass his judgment to Trump. Venezuela fell off the radar screen while we were in Hanoi, but when I returned from Vietnam on March 1st, it was again front and center. Guaido, now touring Latin America, was at last seriously considering how to re-enter Venezuela, whether overland or flying to Caracas directly. I kept Trump posted, and he said to me on Sunday, March 3rd, he, Guaido, doesn't have what it takes. Stay away from it a little. Don't get too much involved. Which was like saying, don't get too pregnant. In any case, Guaido seized the initiative the next day, despite the risks, flying into Venezuela that morning. This showed the courage he had demonstrated earlier and relieved me greatly. Live shots over the internet throughout the day showed Guaido's dramatic return to Caracas, which proved to be a triumph. One immigration inspector said to him, "Welcome home, Mr. President." Riding from the airport through his home state, Guaido was greeted by cheering crowds the whole way, and no sign of military or police efforts to arrest him. Buoyed by Guaido's successful return, I was prepared to do the most we could to increase pressure on Maduro, starting with imposing sanctions on the entire government and taking more steps against the banking sector, all of which we should have done in January, but which we ultimately put in place. At a principals committee to discuss our plans, Mnuchin was resistant, but he was overwhelmed by others, with Perry politely explaining to him how oil and gas markets actually worked internationally, Kudlow and Ross disputing his economic analysis, and even Kirsten Nielsen chiming in for stricter sanctions. Pompeo was largely silent. I said again, we had only two choices in Venezuela, win and lose. Using an analogy from the 1956 Suez Canal crisis, I said we had Maduro by the windpipe and needed to constrict it, which made Mnuchin start visibly. He was worried that steps in the banking sector would hurt Visa and MasterCard, which he wanted to keep alive for the day after. I said, as did Perry and Kudlow, there wouldn't be any day after unless we increased pressure dramatically, the sooner the better. This wasn't some academic exercise. As for Mnuchin's concern for the harm we would cause the Venezuelan people, I pointed out that Maduro had already killed over 40 during this round of opposition activity, and hundreds of thousands risked their lives every time they went into the streets to protest. They weren't thinking about Visa and MasterCard. The poorest people didn't have Visa or MasterCard, and they were already crushed by Venezuela's collapsed economy. Really, there was a revolution going on, and Mnuchin worried about credit cards. At the end of March 7th, we had word of massive power outages across Venezuela, exacerbated by the decrepit state of the country's power grid. My first thought was that Guaido or someone had decided to take matters into their own